Hello and welcome. If you're listening to this, perhaps you're settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, letting the weight of the day slowly lift away. Tonight, we're going on a journey, not a hurried one, but the kind of journey where time moves differently, where each moment stretches out like the horizon itself. We're traveling to Mongolia. Close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine vast grasslands that seem to go on forever, endless sky, the kind of openness that makes you realize just how big the world really is, and somehow how peaceful that can feel. Mongolia, a land of extremes and contradictions, one of the most sparsely populated countries on Earth, yet home to one of history's greatest empires, a place where ancient traditions still pulse through modern life, where nomadic herders still move with their animals across steppes that their ancestors crossed centuries ago. Tonight, we're going to explore this remarkable place together. Slowly, gently, we'll wander through its history, from the very beginning, when the first humans discovered these wide open lands, through the rise of empires that changed the world, to the quiet, resilient nation that exists today. There's no rush, nowhere we need to be, just stories, unfolding like the grasslands themselves, one gentle wave after another. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, let yourself sink a little deeper into comfort. We begin our journey in the landscape itself, in the geography that shaped everything that would come after. Let's start with the land. Chapter 1: Location and Geography. Mongolia sits in the heart of East Asia, cradled between two giants. To the north, Russia stretches across the horizon. To the south, east and west, China surrounds the remaining borders. Mongolia is landlocked, completely landlocked. No ocean touches its shores. It exists in the interior of the continent, far from any sea breeze or coastal fog. Just land and sky, and the wind that moves between them. And what land it is. Imagine for a moment 1.56 million square kilometers. It's hard to picture something so vast, isn't it? But try. Picture an area so large it makes Mongolia roughly the 18th or 19th largest country in the entire world. Larger than France, Germany and Spain combined. Larger than the state of Alaska. A country where you could drive for days and still see nothing but the endless sweep of the steppe. This enormous country sits in a very specific part of our planet. Most of Mongolia lies between latitudes 41 degrees and 52 degrees north, and longitudes 87 degrees and 120 degrees east. These are just numbers, of course, but they tell us something important. They tell us Mongolia occupies the deep interior of Eastern Asia, far from any ocean, far from the moderating influence of water. This is a land shaped by extremes, by distance, by isolation. The terrain itself is a study in elevation and contrast. Close your eyes and picture mountains. Not just any mountains, but the ancient weathered peaks of the Altai range, rising in the west and north. These mountains are old, some of the oldest on Earth, and they anchor the country like great stone sentinels. From these heights, the land slopes downward, gradually, patiently, toward the plains and depressions in the east and south. It's as if the entire country is tilted, ever so gently, like a table with one side slightly raised. And here's something remarkable. The average elevation of Mongolia is about 1,580 meters. That's around 5,180 feet above sea level. To put that in perspective, that's higher than a mile up in the air. The entire country sits at altitude. This makes Mongolia one of the world's highest countries by mean elevation. Even the low points are high. Even the valleys breathe thin air. The highest point of all stands in those western Altai mountains, Khuiten Peak, also known as Huiten or Naadam Festival, depending on who's telling the story. This mountain reaches about 4,374 meters into the sky. That's over 14,000 feet. High enough for permanent snow. High enough that the air grows rare and cold. High enough to see the curvature of the world spread out below. But Mongolia isn't all mountains. In the south, stretching across a landscape like an ancient sea of stone, lies part of the Gobi Desert. Now, when most people hear the word desert, they picture sand, golden dunes rolling endlessly under a blazing sun. But the Gobi is different. The Gobi is a cold desert, a place composed largely of rock and gravel and bare ground. Yes, there are some areas with sand dunes, sculpted by wind into smooth, flowing shapes. But much of it is harder, more austere, a landscape stripped down to its essence. Between the mountains and the desert, between the extremes, lies the heart of Mongolia, the steppe, the Mongolian plateau, the Central Asian steppe. These names describe something almost impossible to capture in words. Grasslands, vast rolling grasslands that seem to go on forever. They cover a large share of Mongolia's territory, and in summer they turn green and gold, rippling in the wind like a living ocean. This is where the nomads have always lived. This is where horses run free. This is a landscape that shaped a people and, eventually, an empire. Water in Mongolia is precious. The country has relatively little surface water, no great rivers cutting through the land, no chains of lakes dotting the countryside. But there are exceptions, and one of them is extraordinary. Lake Khövsgöl in the north is one of Asia's largest freshwater lakes, deep and clear and cold. The locals call it the younger sister of Lake Baikal, which lies just across the border in Russia. Lake Khövsgöl holds nearly 70% of Mongolia's fresh water, and in winter, it freezes so thick you can drive trucks across its surface. Scattered across the country, you'll also find smaller lakes, many of them salt lakes, alkaline and shimmering in the sun. Marshes appear in low-lying areas, providing refuge for migrating birds and rare wetland plants. These pockets of water are like oases in a land that often seems defined by its dryness. Mongolia is big, really big. It stretches roughly 2,400 kilometers from west to east. Imagine traveling that distance, the landscape changing slowly. Mountains giving way to desert, desert to grassland, grassland back to mountains again. From north to south, it spans about 1,260 kilometers. And all along its edges, Mongolia shares borders totaling over 8,200 kilometers, but only with two countries. Russia to the north, China wrapping around the south and east and west. Just two neighbors, just the steppe and the mountains and the sky. This is where our story begins, in this landlocked country, in this high, dry, windswept place, in a landscape that seems almost too big to comprehend, yet somehow feels intimately connected to everyone who has ever called it home. Take a breath. Let that image settle in your mind. The endless grasslands, the distant mountains, the huge sky. Now, let's go back even further, to the very beginning, to when the first humans arrived in this vast and beautiful land. Chapter 2: Early Human Presence. Now we go back, far back, to a time before nations, before empires, before the idea of Mongolia even existed, to a time when the world was colder, stranger, and the only people walking the earth were small bands of hunters following the herds. 45,000 years ago. It's almost impossible to grasp that kind of time, isn't it? But let's try. 45,000 years ago, there were no cities, no farms, no written language, just people, moving across the landscape, seeking shelter, food, and safety. And in what is now northern Mongolia, in the Khangai Mountains, some of those people found a place to stop. We know this because of a site called Tolbor 16. Tolbor 16 sits in the northern Khangai Mountains, and it represents the earliest known modern human occupation in Mongolia. When archaeologists excavated this site, they found layer after layer of ancient soil, and embedded in those layers, they found tools, stone tools, thousands of them, hundreds associated with the very oldest occupation layer. These weren't random rocks. These were carefully crafted implements, shaped with skill and intention. The people who made these tools used something called blade technology. They struck long, narrow blades from prepared stone cores, a technique that was standardized, repeatable, efficient. This is what archaeologists call initial Upper Paleolithic technology, and it's significant because the same style of tool making appears at sites in Siberia and northwest China around the same time. What does that tell us? It tells us these people weren't isolated. They were part of something larger, a shared cultural tradition that spread across a vast region. Early Homo sapiens, modern humans like us, dispersing across northern Asia, carrying their knowledge and techniques with them. Imagine that journey. Imagine small groups, maybe just a few dozen people, moving slowly across the steppe, following rivers, tracking animal herds, sharing stories around fires at night, and every so often stopping at a good spot, a sheltered valley, a cave, a place with water and game nearby, and staying for a while. Tolbor 16 was one of those places. The environment then was different from today. Scientists have analyzed the environmental evidence at Tolbor 16. Bits of pollen, ancient plant remains, animal bones. And what they found is fascinating. These early humans occupied Mongolia during a relatively warmer and wetter phase of the Pleistocene. The Ice Age was still happening. Glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere, but in this part of the world, the climate had momentarily softened. The grasslands thrived, and where grass grows thick, animals follow. Bison roamed the steppe. Wild sheep and goats picked their way across rocky slopes. Horses, the ancestors of the animals that would one day carry Mongol warriors across continents, grazed in herds. These large grazing animals were the lifeblood of early human communities. They provided meat, hides, bone for tools, sinew for binding. Everything these people needed to survive. Mongolia, it turns out, sat along what researchers now call the northern route of human dispersal. As modern humans spread out from Africa, moving east and north across Eurasia, they travelled along different pathways. Some went south, following coastlines. Others went north, across the great steppe that stretches from the Black Sea all the way to the Pacific. Mongolia was part of that northern corridor, a bridge connecting Siberia and northern China during the late Pleistocene. People passed through, some stayed, and over thousands of years, they left traces of their presence. But tools aren't the only evidence we have. In the Salkit Valley in northeast Mongolia, someone made an extraordinary discovery, a piece of bone, a fragment of a skull. At first, it was called Mongolanthropus, because no one was quite sure what it was. An ancient human, certainly. But how ancient? And what kind of human? The answers came slowly, through careful scientific analysis. Radiocarbon dating of the collagen, the protein preserved in the bone, revealed that this individual lived about 34,950 to 33,900 years ago. That places them in the early Upper Paleolithic, somewhat later than the earliest occupation at Tolbor 16, but still incredibly ancient. This person walked the earth more than 30,000 years before the first pyramids were built. But were they like us? Were they modern humans? To find out, scientists extracted DNA from the bone. It's difficult, delicate work. Ancient DNA is fragmented, degraded, contaminated with modern bacteria and fungi. But with patience and advanced technology, they succeeded. They recovered mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line. And what they found was clear. The Salkit individual belonged to haplogroup N, a lineage of modern Homo sapiens, not an archaic species, not a Neanderthal or a Denisovan, though those cousins of ours once roamed this part of the world too. No, this was one of us, anatomically modern, fully human. But the story gets even more interesting. When researchers conducted a more detailed genomic analysis, looking at the nuclear DNA, they found something remarkable. Segments of Denisovan ancestry, segments of Neanderthal ancestry. This person, this individual who died more than 34,000 years ago in what is now Mongolia, carried genetic echoes of earlier, archaic populations. What does that mean? It means that sometime before this person's ancestors reached Mongolia, maybe thousands of years before, maybe tens of thousands, their lineage had interbred with Denisovans and Neanderthals. Those meetings happened somewhere in Eurasia, and the genetic legacy was passed down through generations. So the people living in ancient Mongolia weren't pure Homo sapiens in some genetic sense. They were the product of a complex history, a history of migration, encounter, and mixture. Just like all of us today. Together, the stone tools from Tolbor 16 and the skull from Salkit Valley paint a picture. Modern humans were present in Mongolia by at least 45,000 years ago. They persisted there through at least 34,000 to 35,000 years ago, and likely much longer. They made sophisticated tools. They hunted large game on the grasslands. They survived ice ages and climate shifts. They carried genetic traces of earlier human species. and they moved constantly, restlessly across the landscape, making Mongolia an important corridor in the early human story. This windswept, high-altitude plateau, this land of extremes, was home to some of our earliest ancestors. They didn't build monuments, they didn't leave written records, but they left something more fundamental. Proof that humans have been adapting, surviving, and thriving in this harsh and beautiful land for more than 40,000 years. Take a moment to let that sink in. 40,000 years of human presence, generations upon generations, stretching back into the deep past. And now, let's move forward in time, from those early hunter-gatherers to the first settled societies, to the people who began to shape this land in new and lasting ways. Chapter 3: Early Societies and Daily Life. Time passes, thousands of years pass, and gradually, slowly, the people living on the Mongolian steppe began to change the way they lived. By the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, roughly 1400 to 300 BC, something fundamental had shifted. People weren't just hunting wild animals anymore. They were keeping them, breeding them, moving with them across the grasslands in a rhythm that would define Mongolian life for millennia to come. They had developed a pastoral economy. What does that mean? It means their entire way of life centered on herding animals. 5 animals primarily: sheep and goats, hardy and adaptable; cattle, strong and valuable; horses, swift and essential; and camels, patient creatures built for the harshest conditions. Together, these animals provided everything a family needed to survive: milk, meat, wool, hides, transportation, wealth. Dairy production was already important by this time. Imagine the ingenuity required to figure out how to process milk in a land with no refrigeration, no fixed homes. The people of ancient Mongolia mastered it. They made yogurt, cheese, fermented mare's milk called erag. These products could be stored, carried, traded. They turned the summer abundance of milk into sustenance that could last through the winter. But herding wasn't the only source of food. These early communities still hunted. They fished in rivers and lakes. They foraged for wild plants, roots, berries, whatever the steppe offered in its seasons. What they didn't do, interestingly, was farm, at least not regularly. There's no strong evidence for grain farming in Mongolia until much later, roughly 300 to 200 BC. The land, the climate, the lifestyle, none of it favored settled agriculture. The grasslands wanted movement, not plows. And the people left their mark on the landscape. Across many valleys in Mongolia, you can still see them today if you know where to look. Kiriksurs. These are monumental stone structures, circular arrangements of rocks, sometimes with a central mound, sometimes surrounded by standing stones radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. They're beautiful in a stark, ancient way. Kiriksurs functioned as burial monuments. When someone important died, the community would gather stones, hundreds, sometimes thousands of stones, and build. It was labor-intensive. It required coordination. And that was part of the point. These weren't just graves. They were markers of pastoral territories. They were gathering places for seasonal rituals, where communities from different valleys would meet, share stories, trade goods, arrange marriages, settle disputes. They were the social glue that held a scattered, mobile population together. Around 1000 BC, something else changed. Horse riding expanded dramatically. Horses had been part of life for a while, but now people became truly accomplished riders. They bred horses specifically for riding. They developed saddles, bridles, techniques for controlling these powerful animals, and suddenly the world got smaller, or rather, more connected. A journey that might have taken a week on foot could now be done in a day or two on horseback. Distant valleys became neighbors. Alliance networks expanded. Information traveled faster. Trade routes lengthened. The horse didn't just increase mobility, it fundamentally changed the social fabric of the steppe. But what was daily life actually like for these people? It was governed by one simple, inescapable reality: the seasons. In Mongolia, the seasons are extreme. Winter brings cold that can drop to -40 degrees. Summer brings heat, dust, biting insects. Spring is unpredictable. Storms, floods, late freezes that can kill newborn animals. Autumn is the brief, golden window to prepare for winter. Survival meant moving, always moving. Families shifted camps to follow water and grass. In winter, they sought sheltered valleys, places protected from the wind, where animals could scrape through snow to find dry grass. In summer, they moved to higher pastures, cooler elevations, where grass grew lush and insects were fewer. Spring and autumn brought intermediate stops, always calculated to give the herds the best chance. This required knowledge, deep, intricate, ecological knowledge. You had to know the weather patterns, the microclimates of every valley and hillside. You had to know which plants were nutritious for which animals and when they grew. You had to know where water sources were reliable and where they might dry up. You had to predict storms, droughts, harsh winters. Your life and the lives of your animals depended on getting it right. This traditional ecological knowledge was passed down from parent to child, refined over generations. It was more than information. It was a way of seeing the land, of reading it like a book written in grass and sky and wind. Managing the 5 animals: sheep, goat, cattle, horse, camel, was constant work. Each species had different needs. Sheep and goats could survive on poorer pasture, but needed protection from wolves. Cattle were pickier about grass quality, but more resistant to cold. Horses ranged widely and needed space. Camels thrived in the Gobi's harsh conditions, but struggled in wetter climates. You couldn't just turn them loose and hope for the best. You had to watch them, move them, protect them. Know each animal individually. No one family could do it alone. Households often cooperated in multi-family groups. Related families, brothers, cousins, sometimes trusted friends, would camp near each other and share the labor. One family might watch the combined sheep flock while others handled horses or set up a new camp. During busy seasons, shearing, milking, birthing, everyone pitched in. Children, as soon as they could walk, learned to help. This created a community structure where work and responsibilities were divided, but also where everyone depended on everyone else. It was cooperation born of necessity, and it built bonds that could last generations. The food they ate reflected this pastoral life. A typical Bronze Age Mongolian diet was based mainly on meat and milk products: mutton, beef, sometimes horse meat, yogurt, cheese, butter, fermented milk. These were the staples. There were only small additions of wild plants, onions, garlic, berries when available, and little or no cereal grain. No bread, no porridge, just the products of the herd. It was a diet incredibly rich in protein and fat, perfect for the physical demands of herding life in the cold climate, but it was also limiting. It made people entirely dependent on their animals' health. Later, things began to change slightly. With the rise of the Xiongnu Empire in the late 1st millennium BC, some communities near political centers started to incorporate more millet-based foods into their diets. Millet was a hardy grain that could grow in marginal conditions, and trade or tribute might have brought it to certain settlements. But farther from these centers, out on the open steppe, most people kept to the traditional pastoral diet: meat and milk, the way it had always been. Historical accounts of the Xiongnu, written by Chinese observers, so take them with a grain of salt, describe them as mobile pastoral nomads. They had no walled cities, no permanent towns. They moved with the seasons just as their ancestors had. But the accounts also describe something else: a warrior culture. Boys were trained from an early age to hunt and fight on horseback. They learned to ride almost before they could walk. They learned to shoot arrows from a galloping horse, to wheel and charge and retreat with perfect coordination. Herding and warfare used the same skills: horsemanship, archery, endurance, reading the land. A good herder was a potential warrior, and a good warrior knew how to manage animals. Mounted warfare became central to everyday male life. Not constant war necessarily, but the readiness for it. The ability to defend herds from raiders, to raid others when times were hard, to enforce territorial boundaries, to protect the community. This was life on the Bronze and Iron Age steppe. Families moving with the seasons. Children learning the names of every plant and the needs of every animal. Men training on horseback. Women processing milk and wool and hides. Communities gathering at stone monuments to remember the dead and plan for the future. It was hard, uncertain, dependent on weather and luck and the health of animals. But it was also, in its way, free. No lords demanding taxes, no walls confining movement, just the grass, the herds, the endless sky. And from this way of life, from these mobile pastoral communities scattered across the steppe, something larger was beginning to emerge. The first organized states, the first empires. Let's see how that happened. Chapter 4: First Organized States. For centuries, the people of the steppe lived in small groups, clans, tribes, families moving with their herds, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but never united under a single authority. And then, around 209 BC, everything changed. A leader emerged. His name was Modu, sometimes written as Modun, and he did something that had never been done before. He united many tribes under one banner. He created the first large, organized steppe empire in Mongolia, the Xiongnu Confederation. Imagine the challenge of that. Imagine convincing dozens of independent, proud, mobile communities to submit to a single ruler. Communities that had always governed themselves, made their own decisions, followed their own chiefs. But Modu did it. Through charisma, military skill, strategic marriages, ruthless elimination of rivals, he forged unity from chaos. And the empire he built was enormous. At its height, the Xiongnu Empire stretched from Lake Baikal in the north, that deep ancient lake in what is now Siberia, all the way south to the Great Wall of China, from the Tian Shan Mountains in the west to the Greater Khingan Mountains in the east. It covered the Mongolian steppe, parts of Manchuria, chunks of Central Asia, millions of square kilometers under the authority of one man. But how do you govern such a vast territory when your people are constantly moving? The Xiongnu created a confederation, not a rigid, centralized state with bureaucrats and tax collectors in every village, but something more flexible. The empire was made up of many tribes, often said to be around 24 major ones, though the exact number varied. Each tribe retained some autonomy, some internal structure, but all owed loyalty to the supreme leader, called the Shanyu. Below the Shanyu were subordinate kings and nobles. These men controlled regional tribal groups, commanded armies, collected tribute, settled disputes. It was a hierarchy, yes, but one built on personal relationships, oaths of loyalty, shared military success. Power flowed from the center, but it also had to be constantly reinforced through generosity, victory, and charisma. The Xiongnu did have a capital, though. It was called Lut, which means dragon. It sat on the Orkhon River in central Mongolia, a place of green valleys, good water, strategic location. And here's something fascinating. This area will remain a sacred political center for centuries. Later steppe empires, the Turkic Khaganates, even the Mongol Empire would return to the Orkhon Valley, build their own capitals nearby. There was something about this place. Maybe it was practical, central location, good pasture. Or maybe it was symbolic, connecting new empires to the legitimacy of the old. To the south, the Chinese dynasties watched the Xiongnu with fear and fascination. The Xiongnu raided. Often, they swept down from the steppe with cavalry, struck Chinese frontier towns, seized goods and captives, and disappeared back into the grasslands before any retaliation could be organized. These raids were devastating, unpredictable, seemingly unstoppable. The Chinese response was to build and build and build. The Great Wall, that immense structure of stone and packed earth stretching thousands of kilometers across northern China, was strengthened and extended specifically to defend against the Xiongnu. It was one of the largest construction projects in human history, and it was driven in large part by fear of these nomadic horsemen from Mongolia. But no wall lasts forever, and no empire does either. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Xiongnu were in decline. Internal strife, succession disputes, pressure from China, changing climate. The reasons are complex and debated, but the unity Modu had forged began to fracture. The confederation broke apart, and into the vacuum came new powers. Around AD 93, a people called the Xianbei rose to prominence. they took over much of the former Xiongnu territory, establishing their own state that would last until about AD 234. The Xianbei were different in some ways. They may have spoken a different language, had different clan structures, but in other ways, they followed the same pattern. Mobile pastoralism, mounted warfare, a confederation of tribes under a strong leader. The steppe had a template now, and it would be repeated again and again. After the Xianbei came the Rouran. The Rouran Khaganate emerged around 330 AD and lasted until about 555. They ruled from Mongolia, just as the Xiongnu had, and their leader, a man named Shilun, did something significant around the year 402. He took the title Khagan or Khan, meaning something like supreme ruler or great Khan. This title would echo through history. The Turkic rulers would use it. The Mongol rulers would use it. Even today, the word Khan carries weight, carries memory of these ancient steppe empires. The Rouran Khaganate, at its height, was vast. It ruled Mongolia, of course, but also eastern Kazakhstan, parts of Gansu and northern Xinjiang, in what is now western China, Inner Mongolia, parts of northeastern China, southern Siberia. It's astonishing, really, when you look at a map. These were mobile herders, people without cities or settled agriculture, and yet they projected power across an area larger than Western Europe. How did they do it? Horses, mobility, the ability to concentrate force quickly and then disperse, the toughness born of living in one of the harshest climates on Earth, and perhaps most importantly, a social structure that could expand and contract, absorb new tribes, reward loyalty, and punish betrayal. But the Rouran, too, eventually fell. In 552, they were overthrown by another group, the Turks, specifically the Gökturks, sometimes called the First Turkic Khaganate. And these people would build an empire even larger than what came before. The First Turkic Khaganate, from 552 to 603, ruled an enormous swath of Eurasia, from Mongolia in the east all the way to the Caspian Sea in the west. They controlled the Silk Road trade routes. They dealt with China, Persia, Byzantium, the great powers of the age, as equals or even superiors. And they left us something extraordinary, the Orkhon inscriptions. In the Orkhon Valley, that same sacred center where the Xiongnu had once built their capital, the Turks erected stone monuments covered with writing, old Turkic script carved deep into stone. These inscriptions tell the history of the Turkic people, their victories, their ideology, their view of the world. They're some of the oldest written records from the steppe, and they still stand today, weathered but readable. Voices from 1,300 years ago. The First Turkic Khaganate eventually collapsed, torn apart by internal conflict and external pressure. But it rose again. The Second Turkic Khaganate, from 682 to 744, re-established Turkic dominance from Mongolia. It was a phoenix rising from ashes, proof that the steppe could always regenerate, always produce new leaders and new empires. Together, these empires, the Xiongnu, the Xianbei, the Rouran, the First and Second Turkic Khaganates, formed a sequence, a chain of organized nomadic states based in Mongolia. each learning from the one before, each leaving its mark on the land and the people. They created political models, the confederation of tribes under a supreme leader, the use of titles like Shanyu and Kagan, the strategic importance of the Orkhon Valley, the balance between mobility and centralized authority. They created cultural models, the warrior ethic, the horse as the center of life, the tent, the gers, as home, the shamanic traditions, the sky worship, the rituals that bound people to the land and to each other. And they created the infrastructure, not physical infrastructure like roads and buildings, but social infrastructure, the networks, the alliances, the memories of what a steppe empire could be. All of this would be drawn on centuries later by another leader, a man who would unite the tribes once more, a man who would build an empire larger than any before. But we're not there yet. We're still in the centuries between, the gradual changes, the slow transformations that shaped Mongolia and its people over time. Let's explore what happened next. Chapter 5. Gradual changes over time. History doesn't move in straight lines. It cycles, it rises and falls like breath. And nowhere is this more true than on the Mongolian steppe, where empires bloomed and withered with a rhythm that almost seems natural, like the seasons themselves. The Xiongnu Empire, that first great confederation founded in 209 BCE, didn't last forever. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, a few hundred years after Modu first united the tribes, cracks were showing. Internal rivalries flared. Different branches of the ruling family claimed legitimacy. Subordinate tribes began to drift away, pursuing their own interests. And from the south, the Han dynasty of China applied relentless military pressure, launching campaigns, bribing allies, exploiting every division. The Xiongnu fragmented, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but gradually, piece by piece, the unity that Modu had forged came undone. And when a power vacuum opens on the steppe, someone always fills it. In the 2nd through 4th centuries, the Xianbei Confederation rose. They controlled much of the former Xiongnu territory, the same grasslands, the same valleys, the same strategic points. But this wasn't just the Xiongnu under a new name. This was a shift, a new people, or at least a different coalition of peoples asserting dominance. What this showed, more than anything, was a pattern. The steppe would no longer be dominated by a single enduring empire. Instead, it would see a sequence of competing nomadic states. One would rise, flourish for a time, then decline. Another would take its place. Over and over, a cycle of consolidation and fragmentation that would repeat for more than 1,000 years. By the 4th through 6th centuries, another name entered the record, the Rouran Khaganate. Based in Mongolia, the Rouran did something interesting. They formalized things. They adopted the title Khagan for their rulers, a title that carried weight, implied divine favor, suggested supremacy over lesser chiefs. They developed more formal imperial institutions, not a bureaucracy like China's perhaps, but something more structured than the loose confederations of earlier times. This was a subtle but important change. The steppe empires were learning. They were borrowing ideas, from China, from Central Asia, from their own evolving traditions, and adapting them to the realities of nomadic life. The title Khagan would echo forward. Turkic rulers would use it. Mongol rulers would use it. It became part of the political vocabulary of the steppe. But the Ruran, like those before them, eventually fell. In the mid-6th century, they were replaced by the Gökturks, the first Turkic Khaganate, and this marked another shift, this time in language and identity. The Gökturks were Turkic-speaking. Their elites, their rulers, their warriors identified as Turks rather than Mongols or Xiongnu or Ruran. But here's the fascinating thing. They continued the same model, the same steppe imperial structure, the same reliance on mounted warfare, seasonal migration, tribal confederation. They even used the same title, Khagan, and they centered their power in the same place, Mongolia. The Orkhon Valley, in particular, became something special. This green valley in central Mongolia, with its river and grasslands and sacred mountains, had been important for centuries. The Xiongnu had recognized it. The Ruran had known it. But the Turkic Khaganates made it legendary. In the 8th century, they erected monuments there, stone pillars carved with old Turkic script, the Orkhon inscriptions. These weren't just markers or gravestones, they were declarations, histories, ideological statements about who the Turks were, where they came from, what they believed. The inscriptions speak of victories and defeats. They warn against trusting the Chinese. They proclaim the divine mandate of Turkic rulers, and they demonstrate something crucial: the growing use of writing on the steppe. Not just oral tradition anymore, but permanent, carved in stone memory. After the Turkic Khaganates came another cycle of rise and fall. The Uyghur Khaganate dominated in the 8th and 9th centuries. They were allies of the Tang dynasty in China, sophisticated traders, early adopters of Manichaeism and later Buddhism. But they too collapsed, brought down by internal strife and attacks from the Kyrgyz to the north. And then, fragmentation again. For a few centuries, Mongolia saw no single dominant power. Instead, there were tribes and smaller confederations. The Kerid, the Nayman, the Merkid, the Tatar. They competed, allied, fought, traded. Some grew stronger, some weaker. Leaders rose and fell. But no one managed to unite them all. Until one man did. In 1206, at a great gathering called a Kurultai near the Onon River, the tribal leaders proclaimed a new Khan. His birth name was Temujin, but from that day forward, he was known by a different name: Chinggis Khan. Genghis Khan. Chinggis Khan did more than just unite the tribes. He transformed them. He took the loose confederations, the traditional informal structures that had governed steppe life for centuries, and turned them into something more centralized, more organized, more disciplined. He created a decimal military system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. He broke up old tribal loyalties and reorganized people based on military function rather than kinship. He promoted based on merit, not just noble birth. And he created law, the yasa, a code of conduct, of rules, of expectations. It governed everything from military discipline to religious tolerance to the treatment of envoys. It was oral at first, memorized and recited, but it bound the empire together with shared principles. Chinggis Khan combined steppe military traditions, the speed, the horsemanship, the archery, with more formal administration. The result was devastating for his enemies and transformative for Mongolia. Over the 13th century, the Mongol Empire expanded like nothing the world had ever seen. From Mongolia, the armies rode west into Central Asia, Persia, Russia, Eastern Europe. They rode south into China, conquering the Jin dynasty and eventually the Song. They rode east into Korea. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the Indian Ocean, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But size brings complexity, and complexity brings division. Even during Chinggis Khan's lifetime, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons. After his death, these divisions hardened. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had effectively split into separate khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia and the northern steppes, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. All were ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. All nominally acknowledged some level of shared heritage, but in practice, they were independent states, sometimes even at war with each other. This was both growth and decentralization. The Mongol world had expanded beyond anyone's ability to govern it from a single center. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty from 1271 to 1368 represented a major change in another way too. Kublai moved the capital to Beijing. He adopted Chinese imperial institutions, Chinese-style taxation, Chinese bureaucracy. He employed Confucian scholars, built Chinese-style palaces, performed Chinese imperial rituals. He was still a Mongol, still a descendant of Chinggis Khan, but he was also, increasingly, a Chinese emperor. And this meant that Mongolia itself, the homeland, the grasslands where it all began, became something different. A hinterland, a source of soldiers and horses, yes, but no longer the political heart of the empire. This shift was profound. For the first time in centuries, the center of gravity had moved away from Mongolia. And when the Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368, driven out by Chinese rebels who founded the Ming dynasty, the Mongols retreated back to the steppe, back home. But they returned to a fractured land. The 14th and 15th centuries were marked by civil wars. Different Mongol lineages competed for supremacy. The Oirats in the west, the Eastern Mongols under various leaders, claimants to the legacy of Chinggis Khan, fought each other, unable to agree on who should rule. It was a dark period in some ways. The unity and power of the 13th century seemed like a distant dream. But even in fragmentation, the Mongol people endured. They adapted. They survived. Eventually, leaders emerged who began to pull things back together. Dayan Khan, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, reunified many of the Mongol tribes, not into a world empire like before. Those days were gone. but into a coherent political entity that could defend itself, maintain its identity, preserve its traditions. This laid the groundwork for the next era, the early modern Mongol polities. The complex relationship with the Manchu Qing dynasty that would follow. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about what it was like to live through all these changes, what it meant for ordinary people when empires rose and fell, when foreign powers came and went, when the world kept turning but life on the steppe continued, season after season, generation after generation. Let's explore that next. Chapter 6. Outside influence or foreign rule. For most of its history, Mongolia had been the source of empires, not the subject of them. Mongol armies had conquered China, not the other way around. But history has a way of reversing itself, and by the end of the 17th century, everything had changed. Mongolia became part of the Qing dynasty. The Qing were Manchus, a people from northeast of China who had conquered Beijing in 1644 and established themselves as China's new imperial rulers. And unlike previous Chinese dynasties, the Manchus understood the steppe. They were steppe people themselves, in a way. They knew horses, they knew tribal politics, they knew how to speak to Mongol nobles as equals or near equals. This was the first time the whole region of Mongolia was incorporated into a large agrarian empire centered in China, not through Mongol conquest of China, but through Manchu conquest of both. It happened in stages. Inner Mongolia, the southern grasslands closer to Beijing, came under Qing control in 1636, even before the Manchus fully conquered China. The Mongol nobles there saw opportunity in alliance. Better to join the winning side early, secure favorable terms, maintain some autonomy. Outer Mongolia, the vast northern territories, the heartland, held out longer. But in 1691, faced with threats from the Oirat Mongols to the west, and seeing the inevitable dominance of the Qing, the Khalkha nobles swore allegiance to the Manchu emperor. It wasn't exactly conquest, more like submission, a negotiated relationship. But the result was the same. Mongolia was now part of the Qing Empire. Under Qing rule, from roughly 1691 to 1911, Outer Mongolia retained considerable internal autonomy. Local nobles still governed their own territories. Mongols still followed their own laws and customs. Buddhist monasteries still held enormous influence. The Qing didn't try to make Mongolia into a Chinese province in the same way they governed other regions. They understood that would fail. Instead, they managed it through Manchu and Mongol nobility and imperial officials. A careful system of appointments, titles, oversight. Beijing treated Mongolia as a Chinese province in theory, claiming ultimate sovereignty, but in practice allowed significant self-governance as long as loyalty was maintained and tribute paid. Still, something fundamental had shifted. Decisions about Mongolia's future were now made in Beijing, not in Karakorum or on the open steppe. In 1727, something revealing happened. The Treaty of Koyakta. Russia and Qing China sat down and negotiated. They drew lines on maps, fixing borders, determining where Russian territory ended, and Qing territory began, and much of the modern northern border of Mongolia. The line between Mongolia and Russia that still exists today was established in that treaty. Think about that for a moment. Two outside empires negotiating over Mongolian territory without any meaningful Mongol participation or control. Mongolia had become something to be divided and defined by others. The Qing dynasty endured for more than 2 centuries, but by the early 20th century, it was crumbling. Internal rebellion, foreign pressure, corruption, inability to modernize. The old empire was dying, and in 1911, the Xinhai Revolution finally toppled it. The last emperor abdicated. China became a republic, chaotic and fractured. For Mongolia, this seemed like an opportunity. Mongolian nobles and Buddhist lamas, the traditional leadership, declared independence. They installed the Bogd Khan, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism in Mongolia, as head of state. For a brief moment, it seemed Mongolia might reclaim full sovereignty. But the new Chinese Republic didn't agree. It continued to claim Outer Mongolia as Chinese territory. And in 1919, Chinese troops reoccupied Mongolia, dissolving the brief independence. Mongolia was caught between empires again. But this time, a new power entered the equation. Soviet Russia. In 1921, the Bolsheviks had won the Russian Civil War and were looking to spread their influence. Mongolia, with its strategic location and weak Chinese grip, was an obvious target. Soviet forces intervened, driving out both Chinese troops and the White Russian forces who had fled the revolution. Moscow became the dominant external power in Mongolia, almost overnight. In 1924, the Mongolian People's Republic was proclaimed. This was a socialist state modeled on the Soviet Union. One-party communist rule, centralized planning, collectivization of herds, suppression of Buddhism and traditional nobility. It was a dramatic, traumatic transformation of Mongolian society, imposed from above with Soviet backing. Mongolia had traded Chinese domination for Soviet domination. It became a satellite state, not officially part of the USSR, but effectively under its control, politically, militarily, ideologically. Mongolia's fate was tied to Moscow. The 1945 Sino-Soviet Treaty, signed after World War II, formalized things further. A referendum was held with Soviet oversight, so the outcome was never in doubt, and Chinese recognition of Mongolian independence followed. Officially, China dropped its claims. Mongolia was recognized as a separate state. But independence is a complicated word. Mongolia was independent from China, yes, but it was deeply, thoroughly dependent on the Soviet Union. During World War II and throughout the Cold War, Soviet forces were stationed in Mongolia. Soviet advisors ran the government, the economy, the education system, the legal system. The Mongolian military used Soviet equipment, followed Soviet doctrine, took orders coordinated with Moscow. The Mongolian economy was integrated into Soviet planning. Trade, aid, development, all flowed through the USSR. Mongolian children learned Russian in school. Mongolian leaders were trained in Moscow. Mongolian culture, at least officially, was supposed to reflect Soviet socialist ideals. For nearly 70 years, From 1921 to 1990, Mongolia's destiny was shaped by Soviet policy. And then, suddenly, everything changed again. In 1989 and 1990, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe began to collapse. The Berlin Wall fell. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. One by one, they broke free from Soviet control. And in the Soviet Union itself, Gorbachev's reforms were unraveling the system from within. In Mongolia, people watched, and they began to protest. Democratic protests erupted in Ulaanbaatar, the capital. Students, intellectuals, ordinary citizens gathered in the central square, demanding change. They wanted multi-party democracy. They wanted freedom of speech, freedom of association. They wanted to determine their own future. The Mongolian government, reading the writing on the wall, didn't crack down. Instead, it negotiated. In 1990, Mongolia abandoned one-party rule. It transitioned toward a multi-party democracy, peacefully, without bloodshed. It was remarkable, really. After 70 years of communist rule, after centuries of foreign domination in one form or another, Mongolia managed a peaceful democratic transition. And this time, Mongolia retained its independence from both Russia and China. Not a satellite, not a province, a sovereign nation making its own decisions, forging its own path. But what was it like to live through all this? What did foreign rule mean for ordinary Mongolians? The herders, the families, the people just trying to survive and maintain their way of life. Let's explore that next. Chapter 7. Ordinary life under these changes. Empires rise and fall, borders shift on maps, treaties are signed in distant capitals. But for most people, life continues in its own rhythm. The grass still grows, the animals still need tending, winter still comes, harsh and unforgiving. Under Qing rule, from roughly 1691 to 1911, most people in Outer Mongolia lived as they had for centuries, as herding nomads. They moved seasonally with their flocks, spring pastures, summer pastures, autumn, winter, the same cycle their grandparents had followed, and their grandparents before them. Yes, they were now subjects of the Qing Emperor. Yes, they paid taxes and tribute, but those obligations were filtered through local nobles and Buddhist monasteries. The distant imperial officials in Beijing remained distant, abstract. For a herder moving across the grasslands, the Qing Empire was more concept than reality. What changed more noticeably was religion. Tibetan Buddhism had been present in Mongolia for centuries, but under the Qing, it became deeply, thoroughly embedded in daily life. Monasteries multiplied across the landscape, some growing into small cities of their own, housing thousands of monks. Many families sent at least one son to become a monk, sometimes more than one. It was an honor, a path to education, a way to ensure spiritual merit for the family. Religious festivals structured the year. New Year celebrations, summer gatherings, pilgrimages to sacred sites. The monastic calendar became the people's calendar. Even herders far from any monastery would mark time by these occasions, plan their movements around them, travel long distances to participate. Buddhism shaped how people understood the world. Karma, reincarnation, the cycle of suffering and compassion. These weren't abstract philosophies. They were lived beliefs that influenced daily decisions, family relationships, how you treated animals, how you faced hardship. But Qing rule did impose some restrictions. The empire divided Mongolia into banners, administrative units, like provinces, but based more on clan and tribal lines. Qing administrators tried to restrict movement between these banners, to control land use, to know who was where and doing what. For herders, this created tension. Traditional seasonal movements didn't respect banner boundaries. Good pasture was good pasture, regardless of which administrative unit it fell under. So people had to balance, follow the old patterns when possible, navigate imperial rules when necessary, sometimes negotiate with officials, sometimes simply move quietly and hope no one noticed. Trade also changed things. Caravans came from China, bringing tea, cotton cloth, metal goods, grain, tea especially. Tea became essential. Mixed with milk and salt, it was consumed constantly, a source of warmth and comfort and social bonding. Cotton cloth meant warmer, more durable clothing. Metal tools meant better knives, pots, needles. Some Mongols became involved in this caravan trade themselves. They traveled routes between Mongolia, China, and Russia, moving goods, making profit, connecting worlds. For them, life wasn't just about livestock anymore. It was about commerce, negotiation, risk. But most remained focused entirely on their herds. The animals were wealth, security, identity. Everything else was secondary. After the fall of the Qing in 1911, Mongolia briefly tasted independence. But when Chinese troops reoccupied the country in 1919, things got harder. The new Chinese authorities increased taxes. They tried to impose tighter administrative control. They interfered with monastic privileges, with the power of nobles. For ordinary people, this created real hardship. More demands, less autonomy, a sense that outsiders were squeezing the life out of traditional ways. Resentment built, and when the opportunity came, when Soviet-backed revolutionaries offered a path to independence from China, many ordinary Mongols supported it, even if they didn't fully understand what socialism meant. The creation of the Mongolian People's Republic in the 1920s brought sweeping changes. New state taxes, compulsory deliveries of animals and animal products, anti-feudal campaigns that stripped power from the old nobility, anti-clerical campaigns that attacked the monasteries and the lamas. The Soviets and their Mongolian allies saw the traditional structure, nobles and monks controlling land and people, as feudal oppression. They wanted to liberate the common herder. But liberation, as it turned out, came with its own costs. The 1930s were particularly brutal. Stalinist-style purges swept through Mongolia. Monasteries were closed, sometimes destroyed, reduced to rubble. Thousands of lamas were arrested. Many were killed. Religious texts were burned. Sacred objects confiscated or destroyed. Ordinary believers had to practice religion secretly, if at all. Hiding small Buddha statues, whispering prayers, hoping not to be denounced. This broke a central pillar of traditional life. For generations, Buddhism had provided meaning, structure, comfort. Now it was driven underground, treated as counter-revolutionary, dangerous. the psychic wound this created was deep and lasting. Collectivization followed. The government organized state farms and herding cooperatives. Instead of managing only your own family's herds, you became a member of a collective. You received wages or shares. You followed centrally planned routes and quotas. Party officials told you when to move, where to graze, how many animals to deliver to the state. It was efficient in some ways. Collectives could pool resources, share equipment, coordinate veterinary care. But it also removed autonomy. The intimate knowledge a family had of their own animals, their own land. That mattered less now. The plan mattered. The quota mattered. Not everything was negative, though. Soviet influence brought schools. Even to remote areas, the government established schools, often boarding schools where children would stay for months at a time. Literacy campaigns spread. For the first time, ordinary herders could read and write. Knowledge that had been limited to monks and nobles became accessible. Clinics appeared. Doctors, nurses, veterinarians. Modern medicine reached the countryside. Vaccinations for children, treatment for common diseases, veterinary care for herds that reduced losses from disease. A socialist welfare system provided a safety net, guaranteed employment, pensions, basic services. It wasn't luxurious, but it removed some of the precariousness that had always shadowed nomadic life. Children increasingly spent part of the year in boarding schools. Adults interacted regularly with party officials, veterinarians, teachers. Bureaucratic rhythms, meetings, reports, planning sessions overlaid the older, seasonal rhythms of nomadic life. It was a strange hybrid. People still lived in gers, still moved with animals, still relied on milk and meat. But now they also filled out forms, attended political education sessions, sent their children to learn Russian and Marxist theory. And then, in 1990, everything shifted again. The transition away from socialism, the withdrawal of Soviet support. It happened quickly. Almost overnight, the guaranteed structures disappeared. Herds were privatized. People received their share of collective animals and were told, essentially, you're on your own now. For some, this was liberation. Finally, control over their own herds, their own movements, their own decisions. For others, it was terrifying. The collectives, for all their flaws, had provided security, veterinary services, guaranteed markets for animal products, support during harsh winters. Now, those safety nets were gone. Economic uncertainty spread. Without Soviet subsidies, the economy contracted. Jobs disappeared, services reduced. Many people, especially younger people, migrated toward towns and toward Ulaanbaatar, the capital, seeking opportunity. Ulaanbaatar swelled. A city that had been modest and manageable became crowded, chaotic. Ger districts sprouted on the outskirts. Traditional felt tents pitched on small plots of urban land, a strange fusion of nomadic dwelling and city life. Ordinary Mongolians had to adapt from guaranteed state employment and services to market-based livelihoods. Some thrived. Entrepreneurship, long suppressed, flourished. Small businesses, trading ventures, new industries. Others struggled. The market was harsh, unpredictable. Without connections or capital or education, it was easy to fall through the cracks. And yet, many still maintained a herding way of life. Out on the steppe, away from the cities, families continued to move with their animals. The old knowledge, the old skills hadn't been lost. The grass still grew. The seasons still turned. Through all these changes, Qing rule, Chinese occupation, Soviet socialism, democratic transition, the core of Mongolian life persisted. Adapted, yes. Transformed, certainly. But not erased. People endured. They found ways to balance tradition and change, to preserve what mattered while accepting what was necessary. That resilience, that quiet, stubborn ability to survive, might be the most Mongolian thing of all. Now, let's move forward. Let's see how Mongolia emerged into the modern era and what it became in the process. Chapter 8: Transition to the Modern Era. 1911 was a year of endings and beginnings. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled Mongolia for more than 2 centuries, collapsed. The old empire crumbled, and suddenly Mongolia found itself without a master. The nobles and lamas who had chafed under Qing control saw their chance. They gathered, deliberated, and declared independence. They formed the Bogd Khanate, a theocratic monarchy headed by the 8th Bogd Gegin, known as the Bogd Khan. He was the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism in Mongolia, a figure of immense religious authority. Now he was also the political leader of an independent nation. It was a bold declaration, a statement of sovereignty, of self-determination. But declarations are one thing, reality is another. China, or rather, the chaotic new Chinese Republic that emerged from the Qing's ashes, continued to claim Mongolia. They insisted it was still Chinese territory, just temporarily separated, and they backed up those claims with action. Chinese troops moved in and out. Chinese administrators tried to reassert control. Political pressure, economic pressure, military presence. Mongolia's independence was unstable, contested, fragile. It existed more in aspiration than in fact. Then came 1921. A revolution, supported by Soviet Russia, swept through Mongolia. Soviet-backed Mongolian revolutionaries, along with Soviet troops, drove out the Chinese forces. They also expelled White Russian forces. Anti-communist Russians who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and taken refuge in Mongolia, trying to use it as a base. A people's government was established. On paper, Mongolia was still a monarchy. The Bogd Khan remained as a figurehead, but real power now lay with the revolutionaries and their Soviet sponsors. Moscow had become the dominant external influence, replacing Beijing. In 1924, the Bogd Khan died, and with his death, the last link to the old order was severed. The Mongolian People's Republic was proclaimed. No more monarchy, no more theocracy. Mongolia became the world's second socialist state, after the Soviet Union itself. A one-party communist system, closely aligned with Moscow, following the Soviet model in almost every detail. The socialist period stretched from the 1920s to the 1980s, nearly 70 years. And during that time, Mongolia underwent rapid, often traumatic modernization. The government pursued collectivization. Private herds were taken. sometimes voluntarily, often not, and organized into state farms and herding cooperatives. The goal was efficiency, central planning, scientific management of resources. Industrial projects appeared, factories, mines, infrastructure. Mongolia, which had been almost entirely pastoral, began to develop an industrial base. It was modest compared to major powers, but for Mongolia, it was transformative. Education expanded dramatically. Schools spread across the countryside. Boarding schools allowed nomadic children to receive formal education without their families settling permanently. Literacy rates soared. Within a generation, most Mongolians could read and write, something that would have been unimaginable under the old system. Healthcare followed a similar trajectory. Clinics, hospitals, training for doctors and nurses, vaccination campaigns, public health initiatives. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality decreased, but this modernization came at a cost. Religion was suppressed, violently. The monasteries that had been central to Mongolian life for centuries were closed or destroyed. Lamas were arrested, exiled, killed. Buddhist practice was driven underground. Traditional elites, the old nobility, were stripped of power, sometimes imprisoned, their privileges and lands confiscated. The state wanted to create a new Mongolia, a socialist Mongolia, free from what it saw as feudal and religious oppression. But in doing so, it severed connections to the past, broke continuities that had endured for generations. A new socialist constitution created the framework for all this. A one-party system under the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, the MPRP Soviet-style political structures. Central planning that dictated everything from industrial production to where herders could graze their animals. Tight control over public life, over speech, over association. For decades, this system persisted. It was stable in a way, repressive certainly, but it provided order, basic services, a sense of direction. And then, by the late 1980s, cracks began to show. Economic stagnation set in. The Soviet model, which had driven growth in earlier decades, was running out of steam. Central planning couldn't respond to complex economic needs. Inefficiency multiplied. Living standards stalled or declined. And beyond Mongolia's borders, the entire Soviet bloc was in crisis. Gorbachev's reforms in the USSR, Glasnost and Perestroika were unraveling the communist system from within. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. One by one, these countries were breaking free, embracing democracy, rejecting one-party rule. Mongolian intellectuals and youth watched all this, and they began to ask, why not here? Why not Mongolia? Reform movements emerged, quiet at first, then bolder. Calls for democracy, for political freedom, for economic reform. Discussions in universities, in cafes, in small gatherings that grew larger. In early 1990, it all came to a head. Peaceful protests erupted in Ulaanbaatar. Students, intellectuals, ordinary citizens gathered in Shukbata Square, the central square of the capital. They held banners demanding democracy. They gave speeches. They sang songs. And crucially, they held hunger strikes. Young people sitting in the cold, refusing to eat, putting their bodies on the line for change. the communist leadership faced a choice. They could crack down, use force, suppress the protests as China had done in Tiananmen Square just months earlier. Or they could negotiate. They chose negotiation. The leadership resigned. Not all at once, but in stages, under pressure from the streets and from internal reformers. They agreed to open the way for multi-party politics. It was a remarkable, peaceful transition, later called the Democratic Revolution. The first multi-party elections were held in 1990. For the first time in nearly 70 years, Mongolians could choose between different parties, different visions for their country's future. The MPRP, the old Communist Party, actually won that first election. People knew them, trusted them to manage the transition. But the principle had been established. Power would be contested, not monopolized. In 1992, a new democratic constitution was adopted. This wasn't a reformed socialist constitution. This was something fundamentally new. It established a parliamentary republic. It protected human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. It created a framework for a market-oriented economy, moving away from central planning toward private enterprise and competition. On paper, Mongolia had become a democracy, and remarkably, it worked. Not perfectly, not without struggle and setbacks, but it worked. Since the 1990s, Mongolia has developed as a multi-party democracy with competitive elections. Power has changed hands between parties multiple times. Presidents and parliaments have come and gone through the ballot box, not through coups or violence. Mongolia has grown its participation in global institutions. It joined the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, international development organizations. It positioned itself as a neutral player in a region dominated by great powers. Russia to the north, China to the south. Maintaining relationships with both while preserving independence. The economy shifted dramatically. Mining became crucial. Mongolia has vast mineral wealth, copper, gold, coal, rare earth elements. Foreign investment poured in. Mining operations expanded, and with them came wealth, but also volatility. Services and urban growth accelerated. Ulaanbaatar transformed from a modest socialist city into a sprawling modern capital. Skyscrapers rose, shopping malls opened, international businesses arrived. The urban population swelled as people migrated from the countryside seeking opportunity. But this rapid change brought challenges. Inequality grew. Mining wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Urban and rural divides widened. The boom and bust cycles of resource-dependent economies created instability. Years of rapid growth followed by sudden contractions when commodity prices dropped. Many Mongolians found themselves caught between worlds. No longer guaranteed employment and services from the state, but not yet fully integrated into a functioning market economy. The transition was messy, uneven, sometimes painful. Still, Mongolia endured. It navigated the collapse of Soviet support, which had propped up its economy for decades. It built new institutions. It preserved its democracy through economic crises and political scandals. It remained independent in a difficult neighborhood. The transition to the modern era wasn't a single moment. It was a process, ongoing, complicated, still unfolding. From theocratic monarchy to socialist state to multi-party democracy, from isolated pastoralism to global integration, from traditional certainties to modern uncertainties. But through it all, Mongolia remained Mongolia, a distinct nation, a distinct people, finding their own path forward. And what does that path look like today? What is Mongolia known for? What defines it in the eyes of the world? Let's explore that next. Chapter 9. Things the country is known for today. When people around the world think of Mongolia, certain images come to mind, and remarkably, many of those images are still rooted in traditions that stretch back centuries, even millennia. Mongolia is widely known for its nomadic pastoral lifestyle. Even today, in the 21st century, many families still herd livestock across the grasslands. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels. The same 5 animals that sustained their ancestors. They move with the seasons, following the grass and the water, living much as people have lived on this land for thousands of years. It's rare now, this kind of life. In most of the world, nomadic pastoralism has faded into history or been confined to small marginalized populations. But in Mongolia, it persists, not as a museum piece or tourist attraction, but as a living, functioning way of life for a significant portion of the population. And central to this lifestyle is the ger. The ger, called a yurt in Russian and Turkish, is Mongolia's traditional dwelling. It's a round, collapsible tent with a wooden frame covered in layers of felt. At the center is a stove, its chimney rising through a circular opening in the roof. The design is ancient, refined over centuries to be perfectly adapted to the steppe. A ger can be assembled or disassembled in a few hours. It's portable, which is essential for nomadic life, but it's also remarkably sturdy and insulating. In winter, with a fire burning and thick felt layers, it stays warm even when temperatures outside drop to -40. In summer, you can roll up the felt walls to let air flow through. Gers aren't just used in the countryside anymore. On the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar and other cities, you'll find entire districts of gers, families living in traditional dwellings on small urban plots. It's a unique fusion, ancient housing in a modern city. The GR has become a symbol of Mongolia itself. Round, portable, resilient. A shelter that moves with the people rather than pinning them in place. Another visible symbol is the deel. The deel is traditional Mongolian dress, a long belted gown worn by both men and women. It wraps across the front and is held closed by a sash, often made of silk and vibrantly colored. Blue, red, green, gold. Bright hues that stand out against the muted tones of the steppe. Deels are practical. The long sleeves can be rolled down to protect hands from cold or sun. The loose fit allows freedom of movement for riding or working. The sash can carry small items, tools, even a bowl. And they're beautiful, especially the silk deels made for special occasions. Elaborately embroidered, trimmed with contrasting fabric, each one a work of craftsmanship. Nowadays you won't see deels everywhere in daily urban life. City dwellers mostly wear modern clothing, but on holidays, during festivals, in rural areas, the deel is still common. It's a connection to identity, to heritage, wearing a deal says, "I am Mongolian." Of course, when the world thinks of Mongolia, one name dominates all others: Genghis Khan. Mongolia is internationally known as the homeland of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. That empire created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. It profoundly shaped Eurasian trade, connected East and West, facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, religions. Genghis Khan is a complex figure. Conqueror, yes. Destroyer of cities, yes. But also unifier, lawgiver, architect of a system that brought unprecedented mobility and communication across vast distances. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is everywhere. His face appears on currency, on vodka bottles, on billboards. There's a giant statue of him on horseback outside Ulaanbaatar, one of the largest equestrian statues in the world. He's a source of national pride, a symbol of Mongolia's historical greatness. But Mongolia's identity isn't only about the past. Mongolian culture is strongly associated with Naadam, the national festival held every summer. Naadam centers on what are called the three manly games: wrestling, horse racing, and archery. Wrestling, Mongolian wrestling bok, involves men in distinctive costumes trying to force their opponent to touch the ground with anything other than their feet. Champions are celebrated like national heroes. Horse racing, but not the kind you might imagine. These are long-distance races, sometimes 30 kilometers, ridden by children as young as 5 or 6. It's not about the jockey's skill so much as the horse's stamina and spirit. Archery involves both men and women now, shooting traditional composite bows at targets. Precision, focus, connection to the tools that once conquered empires. Naadam is more than sport. It's pageantry, tradition, community gathering. It's a time when the whole country pauses to celebrate what it means to be Mongolian. Music is another area where Mongolia has gained global recognition. Throat singing, kumi, is a technique where a single singer produces multiple pitches simultaneously. It creates an otherworldly, haunting sound, like the wind across the steppe made audible. Different styles produce different tones, some deep and rumbling, some high and whistle-like. And then there are the long songs, Utiindu. These are slow, extended melodies with intricate ornamentation, often about horses, the landscape, love, longing. A single syllable might be stretched across many notes, creating a sense of timelessness. These songs are often accompanied by the morin khur, the horsehead fiddle. It's a 2-stringed instrument carved at the top to resemble a horse's head. The sound is melancholic, evocative, deeply emotional. Together, these musical traditions have been recognized by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage. They've been performed on international stages, recorded, studied. They're Mongolia's voice, made sound. The landscape itself is part of Mongolia's global image. Vast open steppe, deserts, including the Gobi, relatively low population, just over 3 million people in a country the size of Western Europe. This gives Mongolia an image of emptiness, of space, of big skies and endless horizons. It's a landscape that appeals to people tired of crowded cities, of noise, of constant stimulation. Mongolia offers silence, solitude, the kind of openness that lets you see stars from horizon to horizon, unobstructed by light pollution. and hospitality is woven into that landscape. Mongolian hospitality is legendary. If you arrive at a gers, even as a complete stranger, you will be welcomed. Offered milk tea, sute tsai, salty and milky and comforting. Offered dairy products, cheese, dried curds, fermented mare's milk, sometimes vodka. It's considered rude to refuse what is offered. The custom is to accept, at least taste, show respect. This hospitality isn't just generosity, it's practical. In a harsh environment, where distances are vast and help might be far away, welcoming strangers could mean the difference between life and death. So the ethic developed. Help travelers, share what you have. Trust that when you need help, others will do the same. Mongolia is also known for its folk crafts and decorative arts. Felt work, creating intricate designs by layering colored wool, embroidery on deals and wool hangings, leatherwork, boots called gutul with distinctive upturned toes, carved chess pieces shaped like animals, miniature sculptures of horses and camels, metalwork, silver bowls, decorated knife handles, jewelry. These aren't mass-produced commodities. They're often made by individual artisans, passed down through families, each piece unique. And in the contemporary world, Mongolia is also known for something less romantic but equally significant: mineral resources. Mongolia has vast deposits of coal, copper, gold, rare earth elements. Major mining projects have attracted foreign investment from China, Russia, Canada, Australia. The Oyu Tolgoi copper mine in the Gobi Desert is one of the largest in the world. This mineral wealth has driven recent economic growth. It's created jobs, generated revenue, funded infrastructure. But it's also created dependency, inequality, environmental concerns. When commodity prices rise, Mongolia booms. When they fall, the economy contracts sharply. So Mongolia today is known for this complex mixture: ancient traditions and modern industry, nomadic herders and copper mines, throat singing and foreign investment, a small nation maintaining its distinct identity while navigating the pressures and opportunities of globalization. It's a balancing act, one that Mongolia has been managing with varying success since it emerged from Soviet influence. But what does all this look like on the ground? What is Mongolia actually like today for the people living there? Let's explore that final piece. Chapter 10: The Country Today. So what is Mongolia today? Not in memory, not in tradition, but right now, in 2026. It's still that landlocked country in East Asia, wedged between Russia to the north and China to the south. The territory hasn't changed, about 1.56 million square kilometers. Still, the world's 18th largest state, still enormous. But the people, there are more of them now. The population hovers around 3.5 to 3.6 million. That's growth, yes, but in a country this size, it's still remarkably sparse. Mongolia remains the world's most sparsely populated sovereign country. Roughly 6 people per square mile, on average. Think about that. In most of the world, you're surrounded by people. Houses, streets, neighbors. In Mongolia, you can travel for hours and see nothing but grass and sky, and the occasional gers in the distance. But not everyone lives scattered across the steppe anymore. Ulaanbaatar, the capital, is now home to about half of the country's entire population. Half. That's extraordinary urban concentration. The city has swelled over the past few decades as people migrated from the countryside seeking jobs, education, services, opportunity. Ulaanbaatar is a city of contrasts. Modern apartment blocks and shopping malls in the center, sprawling gers districts on the outskirts, where families live in traditional dwellings without running water or sanitation, heating their homes with coal stoves that create thick winter smog. Traffic, noise, construction. A city growing faster than its infrastructure can keep up. Ethnically, Mongolia is relatively homogeneous. About 95% of the population are ethnic Mongols, with Khalkha Mongols as the largest subgroup. The remaining 5% includes Kazakhs, mostly in the west, maintaining their own language and Islamic traditions, Tuvans, and a few other minorities. But overwhelmingly, Mongolia is Mongolian. Politically, Mongolia is a parliamentary republic. The government operates through a unicameral legislature called the State Great Khural. Recently, in 2023, a constitutional amendment expanded the parliament from 76 seats to 126. More representation, at least in theory. More voices in the legislative process. The country has maintained its multi-party democratic system since 1990. Power has changed hands. Elections happen regularly. On the surface, democracy functions. But, and there's always a but, recent democracy indices have noted signs of what they call autocratization, democratic backsliding, concerns about corruption, about media freedom being constrained, about the concentration of power, about institutions weakening. Mongolia's democracy is real but fragile. It exists in a difficult neighborhood, caught between two authoritarian great powers, maintaining independence, maintaining democratic institutions. It requires constant effort, constant vigilance. The economy tells its own story. The national currency is the tugrik, abbreviated as MNT or tug. It fluctuates, sometimes dramatically, against major currencies. Wages, prices, government accounts, all calculated in tugrik, subject to the volatility that comes with a small, resource-dependent economy. And that economy is heavily based on mining, coal, copper, gold. These are Mongolia's major exports. When global commodity prices are high, Mongolia prospers. Foreign investment flows in. Government revenues rise. Jobs multiply. But when prices fall, and they do, cyclically, the economy contracts. Budget deficits appear. Jobs disappear. It's boom and bust, over and over. Beyond mining, services and urban industry are growing, especially in Ulaanbaatar. Retail, telecommunications, construction, finance. The urban economy is diversifying, becoming more complex, but it's still tied, directly or indirectly, to mining revenues that fund much of the broader economy. One bright spot, tourism. Tourism has become a rapidly growing sector. In 2026, international tourist arrivals have surged. Over 600,000 visitors were recorded early in the year, and projections suggest around 1 million visitors by year's end, generating about $2 billion in tourism revenue. People come for the landscapes, the Gobi Desert, the steppe, the mountains, the sense of space, of untouched wilderness. They come for adventure, horseback riding, hiking, eagle hunting demonstrations. They come for culture, staying in gers, attending Naadam festivals, experiencing nomadic hospitality. Mongolia has actively marketed itself as a distinctive tourism destination. Ecotourism, nomadic culture, sustainable travel. It's working. Tourism provides jobs, spreads wealth beyond the mining sector, connects Mongolia to the wider world. And here's something remarkable. Despite urbanization, despite modern economic pressures, roughly a quarter to a third of the population still lives a nomadic or semi-nomadic herding lifestyle. These aren't people pretending to be nomads for tourists. These are families genuinely moving with their herds, following seasonal pastures, living in gers, maintaining traditions that stretch back millennia. Some are purely nomadic, moving 4 or more times a year. Others are semi-nomadic, maintaining a winter base but moving in summer. Still others have transitioned to settled life, but maintain cultural connections to nomadic traditions. This persistence of nomadism is rare globally. Most pastoral societies have been forced or encouraged to settle. But Mongolia has preserved this way of life, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living practice. And the government recognizes its value. Nomadic culture is marketed as a national asset. It's protected, celebrated, used as a symbol of Mongolian distinctiveness in a globalizing world. But life for these herders isn't easy. Climate change is making winters harsher. Phenomena called dzud, where deep snow or ice prevents animals from grazing, can devastate herds. Access to markets, to veterinary services, to education for children. These remain challenges. So Mongolia today exists in tension between tradition and modernity, between nomadic pastoralism and urban growth, between independence and pressure from powerful neighbors, between democratic aspiration and authoritarian drift, between the boom of commodity wealth and the bust of economic vulnerability. It's a small country in terms of population, navigating enormous challenges, but it's endured for thousands of years through conquests and occupations, through revolutions and transformations, and it endures still. The grass still grows on the steppe. Families still move with their herds. Children still learn throat singing and wrestling. The gers still stands, round and portable and resilient. Mongolia isn't frozen in the past. It's changing, adapting, modernizing. But it carries its past with it, in language, in culture, in the very rhythm of life that pulses through the land. And perhaps that's the most Mongolian thing of all. This ability to change while remaining fundamentally the same, to modernize without losing identity, to look forward while honoring what came before. Take a deep breath now. Let that image settle. Mongolia. Ancient and modern, vast and intimate, harsh and beautiful. We've traveled a long way together, from the first stone tools 45,000 years ago to the bustling capital today, from hunter-gatherers to world conquerors to democratic citizens, from the deep past to this present moment. Conclusion. And so, here we are, at the end of our journey across time and space, across the vast grasslands of Mongolia. We began 45,000 years ago, with the first humans sheltering in the Khangai Mountains, chipping stone into tools, following herds across an ice age landscape. We moved through the ages, through bronze and iron, through the rise of empires that shook the world, through conquests and retreats, revolutions and transformations. We watched as Mongolia gave birth to the largest land empire in history, then saw that empire fragment and fade. We saw foreign powers claim this land, rule it, reshape it, and we saw Mongolia emerge again, independent, democratic, distinctly itself. Through all of it, something persisted, something essential. The grass still grows, the seasons still turn. Families still move with their herds, following patterns older than any empire, any ideology, any border drawn on a map. The Gia still stands in the valley. Smoke rises from its chimney. Inside, milk tea steams in a bowl. Outside, horses graze under an endless sky. Mongolia today is not the Mongolia of Genghis Khan, or the Xiongnu, or even of 30 years ago. It's changed. It's modern, complex, connected to the wider world in ways its ancestors never imagined. But it's still Mongolia, still that place where the horizon seems to curve away forever, where silence has weight and texture, where you can feel the presence of all those who came before, the herders and warriors, the monks and revolutionaries, the children and elders who lived and died on this same land. History isn't just about the past, it lives in the present, in the language people speak, the clothes they wear, the stories they tell their children, in the way a horseman sits in the saddle, the way a woman pours tea, the way a family decides when to move camp. Mongolia carries its history lightly, but it carries it always. And now, as you drift toward sleep, let that vastness hold you. Let the image of those wide grasslands, those big skies, settle into your mind like a blessing. You are safe. You are warm. You are allowed to rest. The steppe will still be there tomorrow. The wind will still blow. The stars will still shine over those ancient valleys. But for now, for this moment, there is nothing you need to do. Nowhere you need to be. Just breathe. Just rest. Let Mongolia's story fade gently into the background, like a song heard from a distance, like the last light fading from the western sky. Sleep well.